I already talked in previous chapters about how to use modeling and sculpting tools to your advantage in creating and manipulating geometry. Now it's time to guide the topology itself in the ways we want. Generally, what we see in a mesh are these chained together quads, which always have two clear directions to them. Connected quads then form a loop, a continuous chain of faces and edges, which can be selected by holding Alt. One part of adjusting the topology is to stop a loop in its tracks and kill it where it's no longer needed. Sometimes we don't want our loops to go on forever, but a quad with its four sides will always direct it further onwards. Inserting a face with less or more than four sides will stop the loop since the direction from there is unclear. You can, for example, hide a part of the mesh, select the edge loop you want to get rid of, and slide it into another. You could also select the edge loop and press Ctrl X to dissolve your selection. Make sure to use edge selection for this, to only dissolve edges and not the vertices or faces themselves. The resulting faces are called tris or triangles and n-gons. Triangles consist, of course, of three vertices or three corners, but n-gons are essentially a collective name for pentagons, hectagons, octagons, and so on. The n just stands for any number higher than 4. Alt-selecting the face loops around them shows how they won't continue past those faces. More loops than one can of course be killed at once. One way is by leading 3 edge loops into one and then filling the resulting 2 triangles into a single diamond quad. There are many ways of selecting, merging, and dissolving the loops to get to the diamond, but I'll just do it again by hiding faces to block the loop selection. This is a nice way of reducing the number of edge loops in certain areas. This can also be done 2 times next to each other to create an arc. So now we effectively led 6 edge loops on the top and turned them into 2 edge loops at the bottom. But this introduces another big part of adjusting your topology, which is redirecting the loops instead of just killing them. If we alt-select the face loops around the diamond quads, we can see that the 2 loops that are leading straight into the diamonds have now shifted their direction. This is happening because of the vertices with a number greater or lower than 4 connected edges, which are called poles. So we reduced the number of edge loops, but the face loops have been redirected. Poles will always mark a clear directional shift in the topology instead of just killing a loop in its tracks. In general, you should always only use poles with either 3 or 4 connected edges, never above 5 for reasons that I'll get into in a moment. One way that I like to explain the behavior of these 2 types of poles is to look at them as north and south poles of a magnet. The 3 pole always attracts loops to itself and bends it around them, while the 5 pole detracts loops and pushes them away from them. Having these 2 types next to each other also essentially cancels out the directional shift around them. For example, you could inset, extrude, or bevel a square patch and it will create a circular loop, which is only there because of the 2 types of poles next to each other. So these 4 5 poles on the outer edges are redirecting the loops away from them and are creating a 45-degree angle inwards, while the 4 3 poles in the center are redirecting the loops further towards themselves and bend the face loops even 45 degrees further. This creates an isolated circular patch between the poles and keeps the patches on the inside and outside square. So for example, if you want to create a square patch inside of a circular patch, you would insert 3 poles. But when creating square patches outside of a circular loop, you would insert 5 poles. Redirecting loops is something you will do a lot during retopology, but with practice, the logic of it becomes more second nature. While you are retopologizing for the first few times, it's good to have a little cheat sheet on the side to remind yourself of the principles. You can find one in the assets directory of the course. So if a 5-pole and a 3-pole are opposing forces, that means if they should ever merge, they become a regular 4-sided vertex again. This shows the power dynamic between them quite nicely and how they cancel each other out. But leaving either side of the dynamic out would create a power vacuum. Without the 3 poles and the square patch they create in the center, the circular loops would just continue endlessly and either eventually lead to a hole in the mesh or a triangle fan where everything just kind of collapses in on itself. It's impossible to just have 2 5-poles or just 2 3-poles next to each other. It's just like there cannot be a North Pole without a South Pole. You could try to push it though, and for example try to force 2 5-poles next to each other with 2 diamonds without any 3 poles in between. But this would just create a 2-pole in the center, which is something we want to avoid as much as 6 poles. Likewise, forcing 3 poles onto each other would only be possible by using 6-sided n-gons. So it seems like we avoided any 5 poles, but here's the reason why the n-gons are significant in this. When subdividing an object, all faces will be divided into quads. So when you have a triangle or an n-gon, they will get a pole in the center when they are subdivided. The amount of sides the face has is the amount of edges that are attached to the pole. So a triangle will have a 3-pole in it, and a 5-sided n-gon or pentagon will have a 5-pole in it. So even though it seems like we have 4 3-poles next to each other, without any opposing force, that is not the case. The 6-sided n-gons are the other side of the power dynamic because they are the equivalent of a 6-pole when subdivided. There are also some 3-poles on the outer edges, which are part of this, but you get the idea of how these faces are subdivided. So we can use these methods to redirect and kill loops and create the power dynamics they bring with them. But here's the reason why it's so tricky to use poles, triangles, and n-gons in a mesh. When subdividing a mesh, since 3 poles will always attract loops towards themselves, they produce some amount of pinching on the surface, and 5 poles some amount of stretching, since they detract loops. On a flat surface, this is not an issue, but on a curved surface, this can become very visible. And if the surface is deforming because of a rig or shape keys, it could even get worse. That's one reason to always avoid any n-gons or poles with more than 5 sides, since the stretching will just become too much for a single point. Create an n-gon with 10 sides, for example, and you can see the insane stretching that happens to the pole in the center. So that's why a pentagon is the only acceptable n-gon most of the time. But another important note is, if you plan to export your model, make sure the n-gons are supported in the software you are exporting it to. Some years ago, n-gons were also not supported in Blender, so be aware of that limitation. So poles create issues when the mesh is subdivided, but there are at least ways to mask them. One of them is to place poles, triangles, and n-gons on mostly flat surfaces with no connection to any strong surface curvature. This also includes the edge of the flat areas, which can make poles very visible if they are placed there. You essentially quarantine the problematic geometry onto mostly flat surfaces, and they won't become visible. It's also good to keep in mind that the geometry that the poles are placed on won't heavily deform when rigged, or if they are, that the surface will stay mostly flat. But if textures are used on the surface, this method of hiding extreme stretching might not even work that well, so be aware of that. Another way to hide poles, triangles, and n-gons is to hide them in a crease where they are less noticeable. Still, they should better not be placed on the center or the edges of the crease, but in mostly flat surfaces within them. One thing I generally like to do is to throw loops in a hole, and alternatively what I call graveyards. A hole is an open part in the mesh where loops can be led into instead of killing them with a pole, triangle, or n-gon. It's just important that the hole is hidden away, like for example inside the nose, ear, or behind the eyes. A graveyard is a particularly messy part of the surface where loops are killed without trying to make the surface look super clean or smooth. Because these areas end up as very bumpy, hence the name, I place them, for example, in the top of the crown of the head, where they are hidden under the hair. So these are overall some ways of guiding and adjusting the topology in the way we want.